Welcome to the T1 Determined podcast, where we bridge the conversation of type 1 diabetes and endurance. I'm Joseph Anthony Marcello, a runner, a weightlifter, a mountaineer, and athlete. As someone living with T1D, I'm on a mission to uncover and share science-backed information that drives optimal performance and longevity. And as a storyteller, I'm here to explore and share incredible feats in T1D sports physiology. Let's tackle this together. Today, I sit down with T1D pilot John Roth. John is a United Airlines pilot who was diagnosed with T1D at the age of 37. He lives by the philosophy that discipline leads to freedom. He uses technology and data to proactively manage his glucose levels, enabling him to pursue a demanding career as a commercial pilot. John believes in inspiring others by demonstrating what's possible with a resilient mindset and effective T1D management. As we build this podcast from the ground up, your support is crucial for our continued growth. Wherever you're listening, please share this episode and others with anyone you think might benefit. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and X at T1D_endurance, on Facebook at T1 Determined, and visit our website, T1Determined.net. Before we dive in, a quick but vital disclaimer. I am not a medical doctor. The topics discussed and the recommendations shared by myself and our guests are personal experiences and not medical prescriptions. Use this information in a way that best suits you, and always consult your healthcare team and medical professionals before making any changes to your daily routines, management, or therapies. And now, my conversation with United Airlines pilot John Roth. John, thank you very much for flying over here today. Want to first say, how was the flight from Denver to Boston?
Well, as we like to say in the industry, uneventful. So
Great.
That's kind of the goal of every flight.
I don't know if you know this or not, but I actually made a film. It was my graduate's degree capstone, and the title of it was Denver to Boston because I thought of the idea on a flight from Denver to Boston.
Ah, interesting.
So I'll have to share that with you.
Yeah, so you had about 3.5 hours to think about it?
Yep. Which is honestly a short amount of time to think about a story.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we had no issues, so it's just the beginning of a 3-day trip for us, so it's a good way to start out.
That's great. Well, we really do appreciate you coming all this way to talk to us, and I've been looking forward to this, and I'm really excited. Your story is one that's very unique, and I think it's unique, and then I'd love to first start on this point is that you lived so much of your life without type 1 diabetes. So before type 1 got into the mix, what was your life at that point? And I can imagine it wasn't even in your mind. So career, pilot, wife, kids, how did your life look like before you even got diagnosed?
Yeah, so leading up to it, I'd just been working my way up through kind of the ranks of getting into commercial aviation, also doing a lot of outdoor activities, mountain biking, climbing, doing some mountaineering, a lot of backpacking, whitewater kayaking, that kind of thing. So I was pretty avid, outdoor enthusiast, as is my wife. And actually this past January would be 10 years now with type 1. And I'm currently 47, so I was diagnosed when I was 37. So had made it decent ways through life without having to tackle the challenges of type 1. But it was just a fairly, I guess, standard progression through life. Grew up in Tennessee, spent a lot of summers just up in Maine. Our family has a small cabin up there that my grandparents bought back in the day, so I'm familiar with the Northeast area and kind of the New England area. But primarily grew up in Tennessee, and then went to Ohio State University. Was there, for the duration of my undergrad's degrees, and then worked there in Ohio for a couple of years, working my way up, gaining hours as a flight instructor, and then as a cargo pilot out of Northwest Ohio, and did a little bit of ag and so on. And then worked my way into the regional airlines, continued to build hours. And then, started off with one regional airline where I was based out of primarily Knoxville, but they were primarily out of Charlotte. They were a U.S. Airways carrier back in the early 2000s, and then I moved out west because through college, went out to ski and kind of explore the West a couple times during spring breaks and over Christmas break ski trips and so on. And I kind of had my eye on that area of the country
Yeah.
to kind of go and see what's out there, after I got done with school. So I switched airlines to another regional airline, SkyWest Airlines, and was able to be based in Denver, Colorado. And I was there for 17 years, and the latter portion of that was an instructor with them, and then ultimately kind of made my way to the current position here with United Airlines.
That's really nice how I think that you went to where you wanted to because of your desire, it seems like, for mountains and nature. And it's kind of, I can imagine your desire to fly has some sort of correlation with just loving landscape in general.
Yeah, absolutely. That you like to get out there and see what there is to see. And, there's something to be said for, getting out there and, kind of having that separation from your normal, running around the town or the city or, day-to-day life and, kind of getting away from things and being able to, often see things that, others don't get to see, and just, I was always very, kind of drawn to that, even when I was in, high school, being around Tennessee, you could always get, away from things and did a lot of things out on, whitewater kayaking and so on. You could get to places you can't go to, even by foot.
Yep.
So that was always fun.
That's pretty cool. And to see things from different vantage points, either at the bottom of a canyon or 30,000 feet in the air, it's pretty, you can fly over a region and look at that and know what it looks like at the bottom. That's a cool concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's one of those things where, my family, my parents, although, some might question their parenting decisions, actually encouraged it because, I think there's something to be said for, gaining some skills, I guess, being self-sufficient when you're kind of putting yourself in those situations. And, fast forwarding to getting into, type 1 diabetes, I think some of those thoughts and skills, lend itself well to, management of the disease, as I came to find out, because, often, we find ourselves in a position where it's, for the most part, on us to, manage the disease and do what needs to be done to keep ourselves not only safe, but, ultimately to thrive.
I love that. And I find very similar that when you're in the outdoors and you're doing trips like rafting or camping or mountaineering, it is a lot of the same. It's the basics. Get back to the basics of the skills of like what you need to do to kind of survive throughout the day. It's like you got to travel from point one to point two or point A to point B. How do you best do it safely in a raft? How do you best do it over territory like a glacier? You got to make meals and stuff like that. And it's like it's similar with type 1 is like you're thinking about every single movement and you're thinking about every single decision and you're thinking about timing. If the sun's way in the sky midday, is now the best time to move, or should I sleep during the day and move at night, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, there's lots of examples with that, with various outdoor activities and so on. About 2 years ago, we went for a fly fishing trip in, a remote section of Montana for my friend's 50th birthday. And it was a 20-mile hike / mule ride in there with all our gear on the mules. They dropped us off in the middle of a national forest, and then we floated for 5 days, and then they had to mule everything out of there. And it was remote enough where, any, not really misstep. I mean, you're not walking on pins and needles the whole time, but you're very remote. So you have to think ahead, like you were talking about, many steps ahead to make sure that you're, keeping yourself safe and you're not putting yourself into a position where you then become, a liability to, yourself and others, really.
And if you're already trained in that, then not that you wanted it, but 37 years old comes around and a brand new type 1 diagnosis, at least, the very least, you're already trained for it. But I can imagine that was a huge wrench into your life at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of brief diagnosis story, goes a bit like, the lead up to it, probably I'd say about 3 months or so prior to the actual diagnosis, I started to show what I then came to learn were the symptoms, but, I was in the kind of health and fitness space before that and had, some medical training as far as just, doing wilderness, search and rescue and that kind of thing. So I knew of type 2, and I knew of juvenile diabetes, but I didn't know the intricacies of, the difference between the two. So, at first, you start getting these symptoms and you think like, oh, maybe I just have a flu, I have, just sick, maybe I'm overtraining, and I think the very first sign that I experienced was I started to get, kind of blurry vision at times, looking at things, really far away. And I'm thinking, I wear contacts. So I'm thinking, oh, I just need to go in and get my eyes checked. Went in and got my eyes checked and, got a change in my prescription. That seemed to help. But then other times of the day, it still seemed to be blurry. And I kind of went back and forth with that. And then, another maybe month or so, just really started to notice, like even some of the people on my mountain bike team were like, man, you must be riding a lot. You're losing some weight. I'm like, no, yeah, I'm not, trying to, but okay. And then, not a month later, it got to the point where, my wife had come home from doing a night shift. She's a veterinarian and she had done a night ER shift and I was, kind of getting some breakfast and whatnot and, trying to basically struggle to get, myself, up and out to go on a trip. I was flying, for, the regional airline at the time. And, she's like, we need to go to the hospital. Like this is bad. And, I said, okay.
Was there, at that point, was it accumulation of everything, or did you just were you moving very lethargic till she said that you were just not you and we should get this checked out?
Yeah, it's just a combination of things because I mean, even, probably 3-4 weeks before that, she was asking, are you eating on your trips? Are you doing okay? And, it's kind of in the back of my mind, could there be something more significant going on?
Yeah.
And quite frankly, when I went into the hospital, I even had it in the back of my brain that I could have, maybe some sort of cancer or something because it was just, nothing that I did, no matter how much I ate or drank or tried to recover, could just get that constant, muscle soreness and just tiredness and, struggle to make it through the day out of my system. And, we went into the hospital and, kind of described my symptoms. They brought out a blood glucose meter, did the finger stick and it read high, which means it's high, well beyond 425, 450-ish usually. Brought me back and then, drew blood and, at my time of diagnosis in the ER, they said my blood sugar was at about 970. And, the doctor was just kind of like, well, most people don't walk in at 970. They come in on a stretcher. I was just like, well, I guess that's good, but knowing what I know from my career, as part of a commercial airline pilot and even a private for-hire pilot, you have to, hold basically the highest level of 3 medical certificates. They have a third-class medical, a second, and a first. And commercial airline pilots have to hold a first-class medical. And with that first-class medical comes a number of different parameters to make sure that you're, physically capable to fly, and within reason, you don't have any, known medical issues that could cause incapacitation during flight. So of course my mind immediately goes to, this does not sound good, and while I was, in basically the ER waiting, more treatment and, them to, start backing me out of what was, rapidly, if not fully into, diabetic ketoacidosis, I, look up the FAA website and, there it was, insulin-treated diabetes was a disqualifying event for a first-class medical.
So now not only do you have a life-altering condition at 37 years old, but now for your entire career that you've worked majority of your life up until this point, you're out of a job.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, you look at it and, it just kind of evaporates in front of your eyes. You're like, ooh.
Yeah. Was that almost as bad as the diagnosis itself?
Once I, had time, and while I was in the hospital and kind of recovering, and then kind of had, some time to, come out of the initial, like, okay, what do I need to do to, basically come out of this and not die?
Yeah.
I'm on the records there, and, folks that have gotten quite to that level, or rather of degradation before they were diagnosed. Um, I mean, the doctors that were treating me said that you were within 12 hours of death, based upon my blood work and where my electrolytes were at, and, all that. And a lot of times
personally, from being in a very similar boat, as you know, that within itself is a shock. And then it's kind of like, I think you're right. It's like everything else disappears, and it's just like, okay, how do I live first? Because I'm just lucky to be alive, and I'll put everything on the back burner until I get this at least managed.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, so it was, kind of get out of the hole first, and then kind of assess your surroundings, kind of thing, So, my brain immediately went to, okay, what does this now mean for, career, job, all that.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, it's a joke to say that you approach your boss to say you got arrested over the weekend, but to approach your boss and be like, I got type 1 diabetes.
Right.
I don't know if like I can continue. How did that part go about?
Yeah. So, once I was out of the hospital, I was in the hospital, I think 3 days. So, got, discharged relatively quickly. But yeah, I had to call our chief pilot, was, that each base has a different, chief pilot, and, he was very supportive. But, I had to tell him like, hey, I've got medical condition. I'm definitely going to be out for the foreseeable future. Where do I go from here? And he's like, we started to look through the company policies on long-term disability. When does that kick in, or short and long-term disability? And then, that kind of, took care of things for the immediate future. So it kind of gave you a little bit of time to think and get a hold of, what was going to happen from there.
Yeah.
But, of course, it definitely meant, that was an immediate, stop to flying. You effectively self-disclosed to the FAA, and that, is, immediate termination of your medical. You don't lose your pilot license. Your pilot license is a separate kind of entity from your medical. Your medical allows you to exercise the privileges of the pilot's license.
Yeah.
So it's not that they pull your pilot's license, you just lose your medical. So you can't use this without this,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
It's not like you can reverse the diagnosis and get the medical reinstated.
Yeah.
But as we'll learn later of what you did to change that.
Right. So, that, after I had that conversation with the company, went out on, short-term disability, and, that at least, like I said, stave the tide for a little bit. And then once I started to get a bit of a handle on the disease, and started to, learn about it, the next step was to say, okay, is there a provision that may allow me to get what's called a special issuance for a first-class medical? Because, with the medical certifications, there are certain things that they allow for medically, but it just allows, or it requires, more close supervision.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it a special issuance. And it's generally issued for a shorter time frame. And then it requires, depending on the condition, various records from your treating physicians to be sent to the FAA for them to review. And then if, it meets all the parameters, they can then issue a special issuance. And then that would allow you to kind of return to flying.
At that point, and I think it's inspiring, what was it in you that said, I have to look for these provisions, I have to find a way to get back to this, as opposed to in another scenario, could be like, I am done, there is no other option, I'm going to walk away.
Right.
What was it in you that drove you more to the first option of being like, is it that you love the job so much? Is it that you've just been doing it for so long that you couldn't see another option without it?
I believe it was a combination of both of those, really. Up until that point, through gaining hours, flight instructing, even some the focus of my degree in college, and then working as a cargo pilot, and all that stuff up until that point, a lot of effort had gone into getting to that point. And then also, just the fact, the whole reason why I got into aviation from the beginning, I got my private pilot's license when I was 17 years old.
Yeah.
Actually just up in Maine, and, did a lot of cross country flights down this way.
Yeah.
But, it's something that I always enjoyed, and really, wanted to make a career out of, right? So, I think there's other spots in folks' life where, sometimes you come to those, kind of crux moments where, you can go one way or the other, and, that can significantly change the trajectory of your life, right? Depending on which choice you make. And, at that point I said, okay, I want to make sure that if I do have to abandon this, career, because of this diagnosis, which I had no control over, nor does anyone. I want to make sure that it truly is not an option.
Yeah.
So I started
There's
to.
no other. There must be. You want to exhaust all the other options
Right.
if they do exist out there.
Exactly. And so I started to dig into, what was published through the FAA, and it said it doesn't specify type 1 or type 2 in their what's called an AME, or their medical guide for aviation examiners. And it said, ITDM, or insulin treated diabetes mellitus. It doesn't specify type 1 or type 2. But as soon as you just have to use exogenous insulin, that's what categorizes you as being disqualified. But it said, it's disqualified for a normal type 1 first class medical, but it is potentially something that can be reviewed on a case by case basis for a special issuance. So in the wording there, that kind of gave me a little bit of, glimmer of hope, so to speak. So then I got in touch with an aviation medical service that specializes in, helping pilots with, medical issues and so on.
Yeah.
I got in touch with them, explained where I was at, and one of their physicians, who had also been, doing some work with trying to establish a protocol for insulin treated diabetes, said, no, we and the others had been doing quite a bit of work prior to my inquiry on trying to get a protocol established. And, there'd actually been a number of people who had already been advocating and pushing for a special issuance protocol to be put in place, but they were still, kind of running up against some obstacles, both, some degree of, I guess, ignorant prejudice, within the inner workings of the FAA at the.
And was this directly to type 1 diabetes or diabetes in general, or just overall?
I don't know if it was directed at type 1. It was more towards, I think, an ignorance of not only the condition, but also I guess the basis of it was more upon the lack of some of the technology that we have available to us now.
And I think without getting too much into detail, what people don't know does scare them. And,
Right.
and we're at a point in time where there is a lot of new technology constantly coming out. So even the new technology today is old technology tomorrow.
Right.
So that's a lot to try to put into writing.
Right. Yeah. And, speaking with this one, physician, he said, one of the biggest things that we're lacking at this point to make a more solid case, aside from just the legal, us versus them, with the FAA, was we need data, right? We need data to show that, an insulin treated diabetic can operate safely, in the flight environment, and not be at risk of incapacitation. And, and have, again, not an opinion, not like, oh, well, I know this guy who's, always on top of it and is super healthy and super fit, or, is the perfect diabetic, but you can't just say that. You have to have data, because ultimately, if something were to happen, they have to be able to defend their decision, basically in a court of law, if the worst were to happen, and say, well, everything we have right here says that maybe the diabetes wasn't the factor. There was something else that went wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
And that goes back to data and science.
Right. Right. And, until the advent or the progression, particularly of CGM, it was difficult for them to to attain that data. There was a lot of other people who were working to give them things like, finger stick blood glucose values. And there was a protocol in place for third class medicals, which is kind of like for, private, private pilots or people who are flying, non-commercially, where it required, finger sticks, before and after the flight. And then if you, felt low, you had to, finger stick, and there was just a number of different protocols.
Yeah.
And they had some of that data to say, this is good. Plus there's a couple other countries that were allowing insulin treated diabetics to fly commercially into the U.S. airspace. So they're like, well, they have U.S. citizens on board. They're in our airspace. So why can't we have our own pilots be able to fly our own citizens, right? That was, the pro advocacy side of the house. So with CGM, there's a number of people. My good friend Pietro Marcello, provided data. I opened up all of my CGM data, of
That's
which
awesome
this one
that
doctor
you and others were willing to just share personal data.
And there was a lot of people that were involved in this initiative well outside of myself. So I by no means want to take any, overreaching, credit for this. But, I just told, this aviation medical service, I said, hey, if you want me to show up in, DC with a pink tutu on and walk backwards, just tell me when and where. I don't care.
Yeah.
So
at the very least, like at this point, you found kind of a home, like a direction. There's like the avenue opened up. You saw the run in the woods that kind of led to a wider path.
Exactly. Yeah. So, once, there was that opportunity there to say like, no, we're moving that way, but it's government, so it's slow.
Sure.
And there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. And to some degree, I can't necessarily fault that process because of the stakes that are involved.
It's totally understandable.
Everyone knows, sometimes they're even surprised in the diabetic community when we ultimately did get approval to fly, for first class medicals, and that announcement came out, and we started to do a few podcasts, and the diabetic community, there was definitely a contingent of type 1s that were like, I'd never get on an airplane with a type 1 because they'd only seen or maybe even experienced themselves that downside of it. And so there is that hurdle to get over too, of that stigma of like, oh yeah, I know this guy that's like diabetic and he like falls over in the bushes half the time. I'm like, no, like,
and I think it definitely is a little bit with the emergence of technology and being able to track our trends now.
Right.
But it's also with the emergence of being able to talk about it, to be like, there is a disciplined life with type 1 diabetes, and that, as well as I know, is when you have type 1 diabetes, you can be just as healthy with it.
Right.
More so, personally, I think that I am more healthy now than I was before obviously without ketoacidosis involved, but just my lifestyle factor before diagnosis was not as healthy as it is now.
Yeah. I would totally agree with that as well. I kind of fancied myself as a bit of a, endurance athlete, did some mountain bike racing and that kind of stuff. And thought I ate, quote unquote, ate healthy, which we did, but, once you become diabetic and, your blood glucose is a direct indicator of what exactly those foods and that lifestyle is doing, you become even more acutely aware of that, and I think that if you want to think of a positive, that does kind of make you, or rather necessitate, if you want to attain, good glucose management and avoid long-term complications, it drives you in that direction to be more focused on nutrition, health, lifestyle, and just overall awareness of what's going on. And that ultimately is what kind of made the ability to provide data to the FAA, and to go back to that point, it gave a direction, right? It said, okay, if they need to see this, I need to be one of the people, and I made that kind of one of my missions. Like, I need to be one of the people that is on it.
Yeah. So it kind of had the reverse effect here. Like, if I can prove to them that I can do it, then I have to be in the best possible condition to prove that that's true.
Right. Yeah. And so and to do that, you just have to set out and be, motivated to educate yourself, right? And, my father was in education for a long time, as, my mother always encouraged us as well. But, knowledge is free, right? I mean, it's not limited to, socioeconomic class or what have you, especially in today's age where
That's right.
everything's available, on the internet. You can Google stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of junk out there too. But,
Yeah.
you know, um, if you want to go out and find it, I went online and found, actually, he was a triathlete, or triathlon coach who was based in Australia, but he had an online course and he was type 1. And, he went through a bunch of modules. It was probably like 15 hours of modules, but he went through and explained a lot of the physiology behind type 1 and diabetes, how it interacts with your body. And I used that as the basis to then say, all right, I'm going to try this stuff when I go out for a bike ride. I'm going to try this stuff where, what if I have, eggs and some sausage and like 2 pieces of toast or no toast and, blueberries, and like see where that does with your blood glucose and so on and so
you're
forth.
learning how your body works. You're learning how the overall human physique works, but then you're also learning how your personal body works, because as
Right.
we know, we're all a little bit different.
Right.
But you're starting to experiment with yourself. Is
Right.
this happening while, like, at what point after your diagnosis, within the month range, and then
Yeah.
trying to get back to commercial flying,
Right.
was this all happening at once?
Yeah. So, the learning the disease, and trying to, shift the career track was kind of, in concurrence with one another. So about 6 weeks after my diagnosis, I started to look for things in the company to say, because I'd already been there for 8 years at that point.
Yeah.
And, I knew people in the company, and I, fancied myself as being in good standing with the company, so I, started to look for things that were non-flying. In which case, I was made aware of some opportunities to, get in as a ground instructor with that airline, and went in and interviewed and was able to attain a ground instructor position where I taught all the non-movement flight simulators and the initial ground school for new hires and captain upgrades and so on. And that allowed me to stay with the company while I was kind of pursuing this advocacy with many others to get the, what they call the ITDM protocol, but that special issuance protocol, get some traction with that and do what I could do to help in any way move it forward.
Yeah.
And so that allowed me to stay at that airline. And so I was a ground instructor for a number of years. And I guess the timeline of that, keep in mind, it had been going on for quite a bit before I was ever even aware of it or diagnosed. But it was 7 years, that I was grounded. So it was a long time.
It's a long time to be patient about it.
Yeah.
Did you see progress throughout those 7 years?
Yeah, it would come in spurts. It's there'd be a little flurry of activity, and like they'd want some data, and then they'd have like a medical conference. And they'd say, yeah, we talked to some people, and they seem like they're positive, and like they would have some meetings in DC with the FAA. And they say, well, this person really is not a fan of it, but this other person is very supportive of it. And I even was in contact with one of the physicians there, one of the deputy air surgeons in DC, and he seemed to be an advocate for it. And then you'd hear nothing for a number of months or even a year.
Yeah.
And then they get some more traction. And this was all kind of leading up to it. And I think one thing that was a catalyst that also helped was like prior to COVID. There was the aviation industry was expanding, and they were having a lot of hiring. It was tremendously busy. And so there's also a push by the industry to say like, hey, we don't, if this is safe, we don't want to cut, people out of the industry that would want to be, get into it.
Yeah.
Because of something that could potentially be totally safe, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just new people coming in. I mean, at the time, there was hundreds of airline pilots. Some were type 1 and some were insulin treated type 2 diabetics that had gotten out of their career because of it. And that would provide them a chance to re-enter the workforce, right? So that helped. The economic kind of ball started pushing.
Throughout that whole time period, you had 7 years to learn more and to prove yourself, as I'm sure other people who were kind of in this waiting pattern were in a similar boat to you, where they're just like, all right, what can I be doing? Were you thinking So during that time period, was it on your mind that you're just like, I want to get back, I want to get back. If the opportunity opens up, I'm going to get back.
Yeah.
Was it kind of fading out, being like, I'm never going to get back? Or were you thinking of like, all right, what can I do now to kind of better myself in the future?
Yeah, definitely the latter of those things. I was always looking at it from, what needs to be done so that if tomorrow they just say, all right, we got this protocol, and, just send us your stuff, all your data, right? And all your records from your physicians. And if you meet all these, then we'll go into review and start that process. So again, getting some advisement from, the medical, folks that I talked with, they basically said, the best thing you can do is to try and get as close to non-diabetic blood glucose values with a focus on, trying to prevent lows, because the low blood sugars, are the ones that can, basically cause, you to be incapacitated, or at the very least, get that kind of heady feeling and,
Mhm.
basically not, be a full mental,
Mhm.
up and running.
Yeah.
And they're like, just do what you can to avoid, the low blood sugars and, values below what they consider to be normal, which is 70 milligrams per deciliter. So that, your CGM data, can say like, look, this person does not have a lot of lows, and, they're not at risk of incapacitation in flight.
Mhm.
And so that became my goal, is to say like, all right, I'm going to make sure that my, diabetic management was in that range. Now,
Yeah.
also don't want to be, running yourself at 200 all the time
No.
either.
Yeah, because that means you're feeling lethargic and
Right.
sleepy, and that can
Yeah.
it's not as bad as possibly passing out, but I mean,
Right.
again, prolonged high blood sugar can still blur vision and
Oh
stuff like
yeah. I
that.
mean, all the various, diabetic complications that, folks hear and know about, are generally a result of, prolonged,
Mhm.
hyperglycemia, right?
Yeah.
So anyhow, that became my focus, and, kind of fast forwarding through that, as we came, kind of through, COVID, and, the kind of the shutdown of the airlines to the large capacity. Our company, like many others, we didn't necessarily lay off, but we went, a lot of people went on, reduced schedules
Mhm.
or scaled everything down,
Yeah.
and so on. And, as things started to come back and the airline industry spooled back up after, the COVID years, into the end of 2019 and then into 2020, um, we there was more, I guess, traction there, mainly because they probably had the time to actually put into it from a governmental level, because they didn't have all this other stuff going on,
Yeah.
and they actually issued a protocol. And I said, okay, now there's parameters that they want. Now there's line items that they want. And so now I can go and get those and then send it in. And, it's again, a government entity. So I wasn't expecting, lightning fast response,
Yeah.
but
As
as
it
a,
is, it took them for the only time they focused on this was when that window of time,
yeah,
like open time,
yeah.
opened up for them.
Sure. And, there's been, topics of debate, and they've honed the protocol, and they continue to make some, what I would call, practical changes to it,
Mhm.
since, 2020. But yeah, and, the end of 2019, that protocol finally came out, sent the stuff in, and then going into 2020, right before they kind of really scaled back, training, because of the ramifications of, of those years. There was one last class that I could potentially get into to basically have, my flying reinstated,
Yeah.
and, kind of put some calls in and kind of pushed the button, so to speak, to see if I could get, that final approval of my application for a first special issuance first class medical. And, a couple of the physicians that were at the DC office, really stayed on top of it, and, got in by, the skin of my teeth within weeks. I had that first class medical in hand, and was able to get, basically reinstated with the company and go back. Because I'd been out so long, I had to go back through the full recertification process
Yeah.
with the company to, to get current. But yeah, I mean,
That's amazing that you're willing to do it and you're
yeah,
willing to go through it again.
yeah, but, it's one of those things where, because it had taken so long, and because there were, a lot of obstacles, and spoke with many other people who were involved, it was almost surreal, because, you're just working towards something so long.
Mhm.
And then when it finally actually occurs, and you had that piece of paper in your hand, it was, yeah, it was very, um, Yeah, I mean, it was very surreal, I was like
Yeah.
walking through I don't know, it was like I think it was REI or something, and I got the call from, the deputy flight surgeon that was working on it. She said, "Yeah, Mr. Roth, I'll be emailing your first class medical to you today." And I was like, "What?"
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
couldn't believe it, and I just sat on that until I actually got home, printed it out, and had it in my hand, before I told my wife. So
Absolutely
it was unbelievable,
amazing. And
yeah.
I think it's even more special because I feel from listening and learning about you, it's like you didn't ask for to go out of the industry. You didn't ask for the instructor position. You didn't ask not to fly. So it's like these 7 years got taken away from the career that you love to do, and you didn't ask for it. And then you have the condition thrown on top of it. So
Yeah.
to then be so disciplined, as in disciplined and patient. So when that day finally came, you were ready for it. That's inspiring.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, again, I just want to continue to reiterate that there was many, many, many people that were also working in,
Yeah.
and had come long before me to do, you know, to make that possible.
Yeah.
So,
And yeah,
yeah.
and it's interesting to learn that you weren't the only one. I know there's probably more so type 2 diabetes within the field, but also you weren't the only type 1 diabetic kind of going through a similar situation.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an initial release of 10 medicals. I was not one of those first 10, but they were all established airline pilots that were of that first kind of 10 that were released. And then I was kind of in the next batch, that ultimate, and one of my coworkers, who was also diagnosed a similar time frame, was one of that next batch. And he was, that allowed him to be, he was actually in class with me when we returned to work. So that was really cool. And yeah, I mean, it was just, it all came together. And more importantly, like another driving force behind that wasn't just, myself. I mean, of course I had my own selfish, interests, but, was, allowing others to return to work. And then moreover, to open up that avenue for, new pilots and, kids and what have you,
Hmm.
that had previously been, can't go into military, you can't be an airline pilot. And, to some degree, there was things like even being a firefighter that
Yeah.
was, prohibited depending
And
on,
that's exactly it. You say
yeah,
selfish reasons, but selfish reasons to take care of you and your family. But then the impacts that what you did cause in the whole type 1 diabetic community and the whole disabilities community,
yeah,
it's really like there is that one kid out there that will hear what you went through and then now be like, I can do this.
yeah, exactly. And, a good friend of mine, Pietro, he was kind of at the even more beginnings of his career where he was a flight instructor and then was
Hmm.
diagnosed.
Hmm.
And, he never got to start, the commercial side of things, but he, persisted, and in a similar manner. And, now he's doing a tremendous amount of advocacy, with, going to various, like well, it's not JDRF anymore. It's, Breakthrough
Breakthrough
T1D
T1D. Yeah.
and, Friends for Life conferences and things like that. And, he's now a commercial airline pilot
Hmm.
and has worked his way up through the ranks and, is doing a lot to give back to the community to make people aware of, just that avenue is open,
Yeah.
and I tried to do as much as I could, posting and did some other podcast interviews. And by no means, I don't want to like bring attention to myself. I just want to get the word out to say like, hey, here's something you can do. It's a motivation topic for, folks to say like, oh, I can do that. And
Hmm.
probably one of the um, most enjoyable things while I'm flying is every once in a while you'll see, a kid, that, is getting off and I'm like, oh, he's got a pump on, or,
Yeah.
you see a Dexcom or, a CGM and they're getting off the plane. You're like, hey buddy, are you type 1? They're like, yeah. I'm like, yeah, me too. And
Yep.
they're like, what? And they're just like, they're floored and their parents are like, oh my God, and
Because even if
it's
they
huge.
don't want to be a pilot, it's knowing that a pilot does exist. So it's just like a whole world opens up of what they actually can be.
Yeah. So, that was a big, driving, that it
Hmm.
was a further motivator besides my own, you know, desire to get back to the career that I started.
And I keep bringing this up at the age that you got diagnosed, and it's because that I met a few people who got diagnosed at a later age, but it's becoming more common, but it's not as common as a young
Mhm.
kid. But I think it's a cool perspective to be in that position where you did get diagnosed later, but then to try to empathize with kids growing up with it, even though you didn't have that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And, um, I think a lot of, folks that, you know, that have even become parents, like
Mhm.
they're type 1 and then, have kids, that's always one of the things in the back of your mind is like their own experience. And like they, don't, of course, don't want that to befall their kids, but you can't really control that. And, you just want to make sure that, especially for kids and so on, that they have all the opportunities that are, safe and reasonable, for them to pursue. And, I think as of now, at least in this country, there's very few things that, if you take the initiative to understand the disease and to have, good management that you can't, go out and do,
Mhm.
I mean, active
Agree.
military service is, to my knowledge, is really the only thing left that you can't do.
Mhm.
And I understand that, I
Yeah.
mean, I have friends that are, that were active military or are, and, the rigors that demands, especially in a combat scenario, like, I don't think that would necessarily be reasonable dealing with what
Mhm.
we have to deal
At
with.
least at this point in time,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
what other technologies in the future can help aid us to be in a position to be
Right.
able to do
Yeah.
that safely.
Right. Yeah. Because again, you just don't want to put yourself or be in a position where, you become a liability to the others around you.
Yeah.
And type 1 aside, it's like when you're mountaineering, you read about those scenarios where some climbers get so, fixated on their goal of getting to the summit,
Mhm.
then
That
they
it kind
don't
of
have
clogs
what's,
their sense of
yeah,
whereabouts, decision making, everything can go wrong when
right.
people are thinking very selfishly.
Yeah, and then either they make it, and then on the way down something happens, or they're doing that final, bid for the summit, and again, decision making breaks down,
Mhm.
and they get overly focused, and then now a rescue has to be performed, and now they just put 5, 10, 15 people at risk because of their aspirations, right?
I was taught, and we were taught, when you hook onto a rope, you're hooking onto the responsibility of every person's life on that rope. I can
Mhm.
imagine it's similar for being a pilot. It's that the second you clip in and you're walking over a glacier, you can't be thinking about just yourself.
Right.
You have to
Yeah.
know in the back of your mind, if somebody were to fall through at any moment, you have to be ready to save them,
Right.
because you're saving that person, you're saving the person in front of you or behind you.
Right.
And now if one person goes wrong, you could put multiple lives at jeopardy.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, same very similar, analogy, as,
Hmm.
with flying. I mean, I have always, performed every flight as if my entire family's sitting behind me.
Hmm.
It's just that's the way you have to operate,
Yeah.
and I would never put them at risk, and I would never put any of the, flying public at risk,
Hmm.
and that's one of the inherent responsibilities that you have to have as a commercial airline pilot, is to say, you know, is your condition, are you fit to fly? It's something on every single flight. We have to say, yes, I am fit to fly.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? Well, are you, tired? Are you rested? Are you, not sick, or you don't have any, distracting, I mean, we're not robots, but you don't have any overwhelming, emotional family things going on that would distract you from your job. And that's same kind of responsibility where you don't want to, put those folks at risk.
I think this goes into a great discussion about discipline and routines. I'd like to ask first, before we get into routines or disruption of routines for that matter, how your active lifestyle kind of led to discipline within the realm of piloting,
Hmm.
and what you do to stay active to keep your blood sugars in control, and kind of how that correlates between your personal management style, your diet, and then your physical exertion as well.
Yeah. So, they've always, I guess, because I've been flying from a young age, they've always been kind of intertwined, right? I mean, when you go out and you do various, physical things, whether it be, outdoor activities or, even just training, in the weight room or, doing whatever hit sessions or whatever you want, whatever your chosen means of training is, they're kind of intertwined. And then, with that is to, you know, besides just being able to, I guess, perform and do those activities, whether it be sports or anything else, that's intertwined with like how you operate and live and feel on a daily basis, right? And then also, how you, choose to integrate, healthy living and in eating, whatever your, diet is, I mean, definitely the diet landscape has become very almost polarizing nowadays
Yeah.
with the advent of the internet. Everyone wants to get on on YouTube and
Mhm.
start arguing
And
over
again, we're
which is
not
the
going to
best.
advertise per one certain diet. I think one thing that I
Yeah,
will not argue for, but will state is that find what works for you
right.
and the discipline of it.
Yeah,
And I always say I always will express what I do, but I'm never pushing it on people.
right.
But I am very disciplined. I eat the same breakfast every day. My
Yeah,
lunch is very similar. I
yeah.
know how many carbs I'm getting in, and I change it based off my training workout for that day. And I
Sure.
say training workout because I'm always training for something. So I just live by that mindset.
Yeah,
But I can imagine when you need to get into a routine with a schedule like flying, you have to do similar disciplined
yeah.
activities in order to get your body in shape
Right.
to be able to check off that I am okay to fly today.
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, some of the things you go in and get tested for, if it's a normal medical, first class medical on a yearly basis, they do an EKG, they, check your lungs, check your heart, check your eyes, just do a general, once over physical, and, so being active and maintaining, healthy nutrition will, of course, besides just your general longevity,
Mhm.
lends itself well to that.
Yeah.
And then as far as, the discipline side of that, yeah, it's an interesting topic, I think, because when you start to talk about, here's how I choose to eat, most people will agree that there is a tremendous amount of crap out there that's in
Mhm.
the shelves of the supermarkets and, and the fast food places that, it really would be better if we toned it down,
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
say the
I
least.
think most people, even
Yeah.
if people eat fast food, they're not claiming that fast food is the healthiest option that they could
R
be choosing at
Yeah,
that
yeah,
moment.
and I came across, someone a while back that said, like, you'll probably do well if you maybe eat like your grandparents did, right?
Yeah.
You know? Um, you
I
know
don't know. My grandmother adds a boatload of olive oil to to
Yeah,
everything
well,
that we eat. But
yeah,
she once asked a doctor if olive oil is good for her because her theory was that olive oil lubricates the body and allows the blood to
sure.
flow through. And the
Yeah.
doctor just laughed so hard and said I couldn't disagree with that.
Yeah. That's true, but I think you could make an argument too that I think you could say olive oil is probably better for you than a ton of sugar.
Yep, yep,
Yeah.
completely.
So,
Yeah.
but, but going back to that, I think I was, directing towards the point of, as far as discipline, I don't, and then sometimes people roll that into saying, well, you're restricting because of your disease. You're
Mhm,
restricting yourself.
mhm,
I'm like, I don't really foresee doing what's necessary to attain, healthy control as being restrictive. I look at it more of as a requirement and something that is just needs to be done,
mhm.
you know, and you know, I, I'm not going to have a debate on whether or not I don't know, a giant piece of German chocolate cake is awesome.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
of course it's awesome, but, I don't think we should be having that every day,
No.
you know? So is that restricting myself from having a giant piece of chocolate cake? Yeah. But, is it lending itself to, healthier lifestyle and then ultimately, being in the unique position where every 6 months I have to send, 100 plus pages worth of documents on all of my diabetic control, all my blood work, all my cardiac, all my, vision, all of it into the FAA. It has to be reviewed and ascertained, is this person safe? Um, if I go outside the parameters, that medical's gone.
It seems to
Yeah.
me that the restriction leads to freedom
Yeah, exactly.
in
Yeah.
some cases, like,
Yeah. Because, the way I see it is, if you are understanding the disease, you know how to manage, your insulin timing, your activity levels, your insulin sensitivity, these things, you come to understand that, or, maybe even have to relearn that at different points in your time. Every diabetic will tell you, nothing stays the same.
No.
Like you have to be
Even
knowledgeable
down
to
to a
be,
couple month periods,
yeah.
sometimes every 3 months, even if it's small details, your body shifts per season.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would encourage people to become knowledgeable so that they can be dynamic and,
Mhm.
and maintain that overwhelming kind of, clout of, you know, some people even shy away from saying control, but it's like, well, no, but you are controlling it.
Yeah.
If you're doing it from a place of knowledge and understanding, it's not just, wow, I had a good day today. That was cool, and like,
Yeah. I mean,
kind of,
I always say how well I feel
yeah,
when my blood sugars are
yeah,
in control,
yeah,
and not just the blood sugars, but because I am so managed in everything else, and we'll call it restrictive and everything else, because that's what it is, but allows again to be free. I feel good. And it's
yeah,
hard to explain to people sometimes that it's like,
yeah,
oh no, I can wake up and then go run to, like, at the moment I'm training for another marathon. I can go and run 10 to 15 miles and I still feel good.
right,
I think it's getting the word out there that good controlled blood sugar allows you to do other things, but
yeah,
also allows you to have a healthy mind, healthy heart, healthy body.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And like you said, it lenses. I look at having that, a little bit of discipline can actually lead to freedom. I mean,
Mhm.
um, you could even, wrap that into, sometimes people say, people who are organized are, kind of neurotic and overly disciplined. But a lot of times the people who actually have, you don't have to be crazy with it, but
Yeah.
have some degree of organization tend to have a little bit more freedom because they're not constantly like having to recover from like, oh, I'm 5 minutes late. Oh, I got a speeding ticket. Oh man, there's no parking. Oh, I got to run into work because I'm 5 minutes late. And,
Hmm.
all this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and with diabetes, it's kind of like having the knowledge of how your body responds to different foods and, how you respond to different insulins and so on. I think, and understanding those and even how CGMs work,
Hmm.
knowing that, hey, they're 5 to 15 minutes behind, they're not perfect devices. They're amazing, but they're not perfect, and understanding some of the limitations of them, and just having that knowledge, like,
Yeah.
hey, don't calibrate a Dexcom when it's in the first 6 hours after you insert it, cause it's going to make it freak out, like
Yeah,
that kind
yeah,
of stuff.
but that's it. You learn it
Yeah.
by going through it.
You know,
And I really appreciate how you relate daily organization to type 1 organization.
yeah.
It's like if you're organized throughout your daily life, you're going to be in a position to organize your type 1 diabetes.
Yeah. I came across, a phrase a while back, and it was just like, you know, how you choose to start your day, like I don't, I don't need to go kick a hornet's nest and spend the whole day running across the field getting chased by hornets to know that I shouldn't have kicked the hornet's nest.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you can, if
Yeah.
have at it,
Yeah.
but I choose not to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
So
like, don't go for the cake right first thing in the morning.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like,
Probably
if I
know the
go and I
amount of
have,
insulin you need to give
I
for
was
it
going to
to
make a
not mess
Southern
you up.
reference, but I'll keep it up, in honor of, Massachusetts. If you're, I'm not going to have, a Dunkin' Donuts, you know, first thing in the morning. That's probably not going to go well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And going back to what you said, as far as kind of giving, having some of that control, it's like, as best you can, like I'm a big advocate of, you know, being aware of some of those, I guess, destabilizing, factors and trying to attenuate those as much as possible.
Mhm.
Like a flight instructor years ago that I rode with and, trained with, we were talking about what we call stabilized approaches. When you're landing an airplane, you do, certain things, you set it up from a certain, way and manner and, spacing from the runway and airspeed and this and that to try and, make it as stable as possible.
Yeah.
Right. And with, commercial airline flights, you want to do as much as you can to make it a stabilized approach.
Mhm.
Um, and, we had this discussion of saying, when I was, still learning, we had some really high winds and, a lot of thermals, bouncing the airplane up and down and stuff. And, I was struggling a little bit, and then he was like, "Oh, here, I'll take this one, just, watch." I was like, "Okay." And so, he takes it over, and I was like, "Man, that was amazing. You're, great instructor, great, teacher, and, tens of thousands of hours, right?"
Mhm.
And he's like, "Yeah, that my experience allowed me to get that back you know, in hand,
Yeah.
right?"
Yeah.
But he said, one way to look at it too is, what's the better pilot, the one that can recover from an unstabilized approach or one that never gets into it to begin with? And I said, oh, that's a good perspective to try and do what you can to avoid the unstabilized condition first. And then, if need be, use your experience to get out of it if it's out of if something outside your control maybe happens.
And the point that you're bringing home in this conversation is you're talking about flying right now, and in my mind, all I'm thinking about is type 1 diabetes
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
blood sugar management,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
they
they're
correlate
analogies,
hand in
right?
hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and, going into, doing outdoor, activities or, sometimes, being in situations where you don't have as much, I guess, access and you have to deal with variables, right?
Mhm.
You want to try and do your best to get that level of education for yourself so that when variables are thrown at you, hey, I
What the
can,
variables are.
yeah, and like how you might want to respond to them, like
Yeah.
we go across multiple time zones in a trip. I mean, I came from Denver, now I'm in, Boston. That's a
Yeah.
2-hour time change. I might do 3 to 4, 5 hours of time zone changes in one day. And in the course of 4 days, I might be in 4 different time zones.
Yeah.
And so that's going to affect, when you're going to take your basal, when you're, what you're going to do with when you wake up, when that dawn phenomenon might hit you,
Mhm.
when you want to have your last meal so that you're not, battling, a weird blood sugar at midnight when you really want to get to bed.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually one of my burning questions was what I wanted to ask you was how do you manage the time change difference? And you don't have to get as detailed, like you
Sure.
can get as detailed as you want.
Yeah.
But also like you're flying to and from with different times. Sometimes you're going overnight on red eyes and the body naturally at least for a red eye scenario
Yeah.
overnight and you're not getting sleep, the amount of stress hormones that are released, how that affects your blood sugar.
Sure.
Even after the flight and back into daily life, I can imagine that might linger, but at this point, you probably know how to manage all the differences.
Yeah. Well, all the differences, I
The uncontrolled.
yeah, I mean,
Many
I don't
variables.
want to, and I guess I just want to be very clear in that, like, I don't want to put across the, I don't know, the, persona that like, oh, I got everything handled.
Yeah, yeah. And
Like,
then that's
yeah,
it. And we know that's the truth. I
that's
mean,
just not true.
I'm very
Yeah.
comfortable with
Yeah.
uploading my data and having
Yeah.
people see the amount of times that I went low yesterday.
Yeah.
And it is nice to know. And thank you for admitting that you are a real person, you
Yeah.
as much as me, and
Yeah.
it's not all smooth sailing all the
Yeah.
time with blood sugar control. But
Right. And, but to go back to your question, with the red eyes, which would be a industry term for when you have to fly all night, hence the term when you, in the morning, your eyes are, bit of void. I'm just kidding. No, I try and avoid those,
Yeah.
quite frankly, because before I was diabetic, when I was much younger, I worked as a on-demand cargo pilot who, we had to do a lot of air freight at night.
yeah.
And when I was 24, that sucked really bad.
Yeah.
And and it doesn't treat you any better
I
when
can't
you're
imagine
47.
staying focused for that amount. I mean,
Yeah.
I've worked overnights in the movie industry
Yeah.
on big sets, and it's like you need a different requirement of focus for what you're doing,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to taking off and landing. So I can't imagine not zoning out while because I would lug big pipes, but like at least I don't need my mind with it. I just gotta know my awareness,
Yeah.
but I can kind of zone out and think about the story I'm gonna write later.
Yeah, but kind of educating yourself on what some of the physiology is, not just for a type 1, but just basic physiology.
Yeah, yeah, because
Things like,
those stress hormones happen
oh
everywhere.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. We just have, I would say, the fortune to be able to see it on a CGM, because if you put a CGM on someone who's non-diabetic, they're going to get a lot of the same fluctuations that we get, except that your body is able to keep it within that fine line of,
Mhm.
probably not going much below 70 and probably not going much above 140,
Yeah,
but they're still there. They're just may not be as big.
yeah.
So yeah, knowing like, okay, the later it gets, you're probably going to have a little bit more. I tend to be a little bit more insulin resistant later at night. I know some people are the opposite. They're more insulin resistant in the morning. Um, at night, just saying like I just mentioned, I try to, stop eating, about 2 to 3 hours minimum before I want to go to bed, because again, I just want to make sure that I'm relatively stable and I don't have any big fluctuations going on,
Mhm.
going into when I want to sleep. With the time zone changes, I try and because I do MDI, so I try and do my basal insulin. I do split dosing, so I do a dose in the morning and then one in the evening,
Yeah,
and I try and keep those relatively close to my home time zone.
okay. Do you
Um,
always have, like, a watch on the ho or you're just always aware of what the home time zone is?
yeah, I mean, when you get used to traveling a lot, I mean, plus we have the luxury of iPhones where you
Yeah,
can, oh, look, it's,
yeah, pull up the
but I
thing.
mean, it's not as bad when it's 2 or 3 hours, but when you start doing international stuff, that can get a little crazy.
Yeah,
But yeah, but if it's not possible, if it's a big one, like a 4 hour time zone change, I may have to, say, okay, like basal insulin is not so, precise that an hour slide one way or the other is going to have this wild effect on my blood sugar,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
So I said, okay, I'll just slide it an hour and then,
Yeah, and
maybe
then
slide it
you make
back.
that choice based off the
Yeah.
time zone you're in, like, I can imagine, like, if you're going from Boston to Detroit, that's a different scenario than if you're going to Boston to Los Angeles.
Yeah, like tomorrow morning, our show time is 6:30,
Mhm.
but we're going back and we're going to be in Grand Junction, Colorado tomorrow night. Um, and so, it's a 2 hour time change. So instead of I would normally take my, morning shot of basal insulin at 6 to 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah,
Well, if I do it here, that's gonna be 4:30 in the morning, right?
yeah,
So what I might do is just take a half unit of rapid, and then I'll keep the, morning rise it down, and then I'll delay taking my basal an hour here so that it kind of moderates that time zone change,
yeah. So you
And then
get the insulin still running through you, you keep the blood sugar stable, you prevent any sort of ketones from building up, and
exactly,
you're
yeah.
stable enough for the flight.
Yeah, exactly, and then, even with, when and what you eat, like, flying can be, kind of mentally, taxing sometimes depending on what you're dealing with, as far as, weather and air traffic and,
Mhm,
delays and maintenance and all these kinds of things. Um, but, it's relatively sedentary, quite frankly.
mhm.
I mean, we're sitting up in a flight deck, we're not up there doing backflips,
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
on my flying days, if it's a longer flight day, I'll change what I'm eating.
mhm.
I might eat a little bit less. I tend to eat much lower carbohydrate on days that I'm flying because, again, I just know that if I eat, higher fat and protein, um, it's much more stable.
Mhm.
I
And
don't have to
there's
eat.
less room for insulin reacting if you don't have to eat as much carbs.
Yeah, yeah. If I have, some, protein and fat, that a lot of times I'll bring my own food with me again.
Mhm.
So I'm not at the mercy of, the infamous crew meals,
Yeah.
and, which have a, wide gamut of, very entertaining, industry stories about them.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
or,
Carbohydrates, hidden
yeah, yeah, oh, yeah.
sugars,
Oh,
microplastics.
yeah,
Because
just
we
all
get
of
into
it,
preservatives.
the fact that it's been in the airplane chiller for how many days, So, but, or even just, what you have access to at the airport, or you might be a little bit late or the van gets stuck in traffic and now you're running, you're trying to make it to the airplane to get the flight out on time and you don't have time to stop and get anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, again, just saying, okay, well, I can moderate that variable by saying, I'm going to bring a cooler bag with me with like food that I know what is in there. I know what I can eat. I know what I need to dose for that stuff.
Mhm.
And then that whole variable goes away.
Yeah, create a system for you, and
Yeah.
that's your traveling kit, and
Yeah.
know how to react to every item that you carry with you.
Yeah. I mean, within reason. I mean, yeah, sure. Stress, plays out a little bit differently. You have a really stressful flight or something comes up. I mean, yeah, you're going to have a rise in cortisol and it's going to cause your blood sugar to go up, and, you'll see it. You're like, oh, look, it's nice and stable at, 95 and, up
Yeah.
to 160. And you're like, I haven't had anything to eat in 4 hours.
Yeah.
That's the hormone
Yeah.
response,
And sometimes when you don't eat, the stress kicks in and your blood sugar actually rises.
Yeah. Yeah. That stuff too, and then knowing like, hey, 160, I don't want to hang out there all day long,
Yeah.
but I also don't want to overreact, especially while I'm flying.
Yeah.
And then
It's something that could be manageable until you land.
yeah.
Yeah.
And saying like, hey, if we get past that like massive thunderstorm and, newer controllers,
Mhm.
I'll probably chill out and I'll come back down. If I need to, I'll give a half a unit, and it'll titrate it, but you can't be overreactive either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of, and
Yeah.
I think one of my big last questions and topics, and you kind of already hit on this, is managing it in flight
Mhm.
and the focus that you need if you just want to reiterate on that, especially when you're taking off and landing. Because as you said, when you're actually in flight, unless you're going over some storms, it's pretty like chill. You're not moving, so you don't have
Yeah.
to take physicality into play
Yeah.
as you would on a hike, for example,
Sure. Yeah.
or mountaineering or a bike ride or running. It's a whole lot different. But when you are taking off and landing, I can imagine that you have your blood sugar, you know what it's at, and then you kind of just get into that focus and trust. How big is trust in your playbook?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of, you know, going back to the, know thyself, right?
Mhm.
So, I know that if I've had, or maybe I haven't, well, like this morning, I had, I made some, eggs and some, turkey sausages for myself and,
Yeah.
ate that, right before I went out to the airplane. And I know I'm probably not going to be hungry for many hours after that. I can use a half unit of, Novolin R, and, my blood sugar stayed between, 95 and, 105 for 4.5 hours.
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
you learn like what works for you. And, knowing that like, I haven't eaten anything that's going to make my blood sugar go wildly high, right? I know that I haven't taken, some massive hit of insulin to counteract something weird that I ate, so that I know I'm not going to, more importantly, at risk of a low.
Yeah.
So, that you just have to become comfortable with that and, look at your data, look at those various scenarios, and, know some of your personal signs, like if you feel like you might be getting low or something, and,
Mhm.
that gives you some of that confidence to not have to constantly, be doing this, and looking at your watch, your CGM or pump or whatever it is. So, that's helpful. And, yeah, yeah, I think that's, you just have to kind of learn how you respond to things as a type one, and, take in all that information that you've kind of learned along the way. And if you're new to it, it, if you're going to try something new, whether it be a new food, a new insulin, or, a new fit workout regime or whatever it is, just try and do it in as best a, controlled environment as you can.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll use the personal example is that I've recently introduced creatine,
mhm.
and I will soon be introducing collagen
Yeah.
into my supplement routines.
Yeah.
And I start off by kind of doing less than so for creatine, it's 5 grams. For collagen, it's roughly 15 grams.
Yeah.
But when introducing creatine, I started off with 1 gram per day and did
Yeah.
that for 3, 4, 5 days, see how my blood sugar reacted.
Yeah.
And I upped it to 2.5, and I kind of did that all the way up until 5 grams at once throughout the day. I would split it up throughout the day just to see how my body reacted and that it could handle it.
Mhm.
And then it kind of seamlessly, I didn't realize till after it was already seamlessly into my routine that I managed it perfectly. My insulin did adjust throughout it,
Mhm.
but because I did it in increments, it allowed for a seamless transition.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, and, outside of that, there's always going to be some instances where you have maybe you want to eat something different, or something outside of your routine, and that's where like the knowledge of like how your insulin interacts with you, you can you can still moderate for that. Like I went to visit a friend of mine. We had a Tucson overnight, and he was one of my buddies from college. He's like, "Oh yeah, come on over to the house," and show up, and his wife and his little girl, we're making like homemade corn tortillas, and I don't normally eat a lot of corn tortillas, but it's like his 9-year-old girl's like, they're making them fresh, like right there. Like I'm not going to be a jackass and say no, I'm not eating this
and deny it.
and they were
At
delicious.
At the same time, there are no nutrition facts for it,
right?
but
And I'm like, all right, well, I mean, you kind of can guess like, all right, it's probably like whatever, 15 grams of carbs a piece. They're probably rapid, kind of hit you fast. And so on. So I was like, all right, I'll pre-bolus a little bit, and if I need to correct, I need to correct. And like that one night, it's probably, some people are going to roll their eyes at this, but I went up to like 180, and that's kind of high for me. But it's like, all right, I corrected for it, brought it back down. It wasn't the end of the world. And I got to have a good time with my friends, and it was great.
It's worth it. It's definitely the give and take of like those moments in socializing and friendship and relationships are also what bring longevity too. It also is what brings a healthy life and a well-rounded, well-balanced life.
Yeah, and and going back to some of the flying stability too, I mean, knowing that like they're like, for me, they're particularly sensitive to low blood sugars, right? One of the parameters is you have to turn in your CGM data. You have to have a minimum of 94% wear time of your CGM. So 94% of your time you have to have a CGM on, and if you don't, if you have some issue come up, you have to submit finger stick data,
sensor error.
But anyhow, of that CGM time, if the protocol says less than 4% of your time can be below 70, right? And if you're, 4.5% or 5%, they'll pull your medical, So like I'm particularly,
it's a hardcore number.
Yeah, it's a hardcore number, and then they have, your time in range, 70 to 180. And then like they look at your time above 180 and so on, in those percentages. But going back to the low blood sugar, I know that, I have to be particularly, astute of avoiding lows if at all possible. Do they happen? Sure. I think my last, 6-month data, I had about 2% of the time with lows, right? But it's within the parameters. Most of them are at night, because we all know how that goes.
Even
if the CGM catches it, wakes you up, you got to, drink some Gatorade or something. But, I keep, glucose tabs in my pocket, in my flight bag. I keep, Gatorade, because I know that hits me crazy fast. I mean, I can stop a diagonal arrow down, like dead in its tracks within like 5 minutes with that stuff. It hits me like crazy.
And then one thing that I learned from that is, as soon as it does hit your gut, that sugar's absorbed within seconds.
Oh yeah.
So it's going back into your bloodstream within minutes.
Yeah. And not overcorrecting. Don't sit there and drink half the bottle, or like,
but it's that
eat the kitchen,
that allows you to not do that.
But, you're just like taking some of those things into account for flying and so on. But, and then again, going back into sports and getting outside. So it's I'm not overly focusing on, the flying side of things. The same techniques apply when you're out, like that remote camping, fishing trip I was on, or like when I would do mountain bike races, or backpacking with my wife, or, we have our son now, when we're out with them, again, that's another motivating factor is, now, not only am I providing for my family, but, I want to be a good example for my son. And, I don't ever want to, and people might take offense to this, but I don't want to burden them with my disease, not my disease, but the disease management.
I
mean? And I know, because they're my family, they're very supportive, and I'm not trying to like live on an island, but I want to do everything I can to not put that burden on them unless it's absolutely necessary. And I don't mean to sound offensive by that,
like,
but
no, because it's like, maybe like I do rely on my family members, but I don't want to put them in a position where they have to take, and it might just be me not wanting to lose control of myself.
Sure.
I do
Yeah.
have a personal, I don't know if you want to call it anxiety or whatever it is, of like, I like being in control.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I don't drink alcohol anymore. It's like, I like having my mind and I like having my control, but that's not a selfish thing. That's kind of selfless, because then if you have your type 1 in control, then your family does not have to worry about it as much. Like,
Right.
I can tell you, my family doesn't even follow my blood sugars anymore.
Right,
When I was
yeah.
first diagnosed, they followed it, but now it's like a personal. My fiance, she asked me what's wrong with me. I say blood sugar's low. She's just like, got it.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
she knows exactly what to do. But
Yeah. I mean, I've had those too, like, again, I'm not like the beacon of perfection over here, like every once in a while, get back from a bike ride or something, just whatever happens, you miss time, or maybe you hit a vein with your injection
Yeah.
instead of like, and it just hits you faster than you thought. And, yeah, my wife's like, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, just give me a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'm okay. Like, I'm not going to, tip over, but I'm at like, 62, like, give me a second.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. That kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, there's, integrating that, in with, the, applying it to like the career and so on, the overarching, thing there is, just like we talked about with our families, like, we don't want to burden that, them with, the management of our disease, if at all possible. Just like, going into my career, I want to do as much as I can with, knowledge and understanding CGMs and, nutrition and exercise and, staying fit, so that I don't put, the public at risk, so that's super important for me.
Well, to me, that's very, very inspiring.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that.
It's sincere, and I definitely am learning a lot from you, and I know we're gonna obviously continue to be friends, so I'm excited to continue. And it's the mindset, it's the focused mindset that I really do appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and the other folks that have, done this, setting up until this point, I'm excited to see their, progression, and then, obviously where you're going with the expedition and, moving even beyond that. It's a great venture, and I was, really excited to be asked to be, part of it. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, we can officially say that you're the first person to fly in.
Yeah.
One day we'll be able to fly either people in or fly to everybody.
Yeah.
But you went a lot out of your way to get here. So that is definitely on the top of my list of gratitude.
Oh, no worries.
I would really like to ask you, and I ask a lot of people, if they were to approach a kid growing up with type 1, and I think it would be the same, but this is a unique opportunity to ask this specific question. If you were to condense it within, not going to cut off a couple sentences or so, what would you tell a person who is around the age of 37 that just got diagnosed? What you know now about living with type 1 for 10 years, what would you, either if it's a younger version of yourself or just somebody within that same sort of life checkpoint that you were in when you did get diagnosed, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think I would try and offer some reassurance to just, say, this is 100% a livable condition, and not just livable, but you can live absolutely your best life without limitations, provided you take the initiative to educate yourself on the disease and what that is going to require for you and your lifestyle, and to, not allow it to limit you. But you do have to put some work in. And if you put the work in, it's very manageable. But also don't be hesitant to lean on others and to ask for assistance or a leg up, from those that have already gone before you, right? There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. There's people that you can ask and, learn some things from and get education from that can help you, take big steps over the obstacles instead of little ones, right? And there will be obstacles, but you just got to keep pushing forward and get past them. And, on the backside of it, you can live as long of a natural life as you choose to, but that does require that you take responsibility of, your condition, and follow through. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And that speaks close to me because this is part of the mission for the podcast, is to spread education. And somebody's going to be watching what you said today, and they're going to take that advice that you just said, but the advice that you've said for this entire episode, take that to heart and really learn from that. And that, to me, is what is making this whole podcast experience very special. It's trying to reach the people who maybe they do have everything well managed. As you know, well managed means not every day is good. We all go through our ups and downs, but maybe they don't. And no matter what, they'll listen to you today and just take something with them. And to me, that is invaluable. And I think there needs to be a lot more education across the country and the world. And you're helping with that, and you're helping show people what is possible with type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely a proponent of trying the best I can to be a positive example. We all have our faults and shortcomings, but I'm doing the best I can.
Yeah. If people want to reach out for any specific questions, just get in touch. What's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, so I do have an account on Instagram that's just a T1 Flyer. You can send me a message on there, and then in the if you do a show notes, you have my email. You can always reach out there, or just even on Facebook. I'm just John Roth on Facebook.
We'll provide all the links to that.
And you can reach out to me on there on Messenger. I mean, the world of social media is changing all the time, but I don't have a type 1 platform per se. I just I
mean, that's the goal of the podcast, is talk to, I don't want to say average people, because we're not average and you're not average, and it's to talk to a whole wide variety of people. So you don't have to have a huge following. You don't have to have a whole content platform, but you're a pilot as a type 1 diabetic, and you're an outdoorsman. So that's something really unique.
Yeah. Thank you. But if folks can reach out to me there if they have any, questions on, just, flying, what's involved, what, some avenues are to get into it, even from, no experience to, if you're maybe, just flying privately and, want to look at some avenues to get into it commercially, I can do, either point you into some resources or, help you out there. I've gotten in contact with a few parents that have type 1 kids that, are interested in it. I'm more than happy to talk with them about that. Or even folks that are kind of doing some outdoor activities and so on. I fancy myself as a bit of a, as being somewhat knowledgeable with, giving some guidance on that. So, more than happy to talk about all that.
In that case, we're going to have to plan a time for me to go from not Denver to Boston, but Boston to Denver. And we'll plan a hike. Mount Massive is on my checklist. I want to do some more 14ers out there, so we make something happen.
Yeah, there's a couple really easy ones to get to right outside of Denver, as long as you get past the I-70 traffic.
Not as bad as the Boston traffic today.
that was pretty good. That was some good traffic.
Well, thank you again very much, John.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you again to John Roth for sharing his story. His disciplined approach to managing T1D is a powerful reminder that preparation and resilience can unlock a world of possibilities. You can follow John on Facebook at John Roth and on Instagram at T1 Flyer. For all our content, please visit t1determined.net. Connect with us on social media. Find us on Instagram, TikTok, and X at T1D_endurance and Facebook at T1 Determined. Until next time, keep pushing your limits. I hope this helps. Stay strong, stay determined. T1 Determined.